Good day, everyone. My name is Ernest Cook. I'm a co-chair of the Network for Landscape Conservation. I'd like to welcome you to our forum on landscape conservation policy. We're pleased to have almost 1,000 people registered for this event from an extraordinary array of sectors and geographies across the entire United States and as far away as Australia and Zimbabwe. Thank you for joining us today. Clearly, this is an important and timely issue that deeply touches us all. During the forum, we encourage you to share your thoughts in the chat box. We won't be able to respond to that in the moment, but we'll save your remarks as part of the strategic thinking of the forum and capture them as best we can in the summary document we prepare afterwards. The Network for Landscape Conservation focuses specifically on bringing people together to advance collaborative conservation at the necessary landscape scale. We have more than 3,000 members and 300 organizational partners. We have a cross-sector and cross-geography leadership team of 30 nonprofit organizations, agencies, tribes, academic institutions, private natural resource-based companies, and more. We are a fiscally sponsored project of the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. I'd like to turn now to my fellow co-chair, Julie Reagan.
Thank you, Ernest. I'm Julie Reagan with the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. My organization is a pioneer in cross-jurisdictional conservation in Lake Tahoe, and I'm proud to be kicking off this virtual forum live from high in the Sierra Nevada. As co-chair of the network for the last 3 years, I've had the pleasure of watching our network grow and become a leading voice and national convener on collaborative conservation. Some of you may have attended our national meetings or read the Pathways Forward report from our last convening in West Virginia. After today, we hope you'll take a fresh look at our strategic initiatives and get more involved. Today's forum is the first in a policy series, with additional virtual gatherings planned on advancing Indigenous landscape conservation, as well as on issues of state and private land policy. We are honored to have Terry Tatsey here today, who is a former council member and member of the Blackfeet Nation. To open the forum, I'd like to ask him to say a few words of welcome and offer perspective. Thank you so much, Terry.
Thank you, Julie. Okay. Mi studi Danaku, my Stosawatsis. I introduced myself in my Blackfeet language because first and foremost, that's who I am, that's who I represent today, and the things that I've been taught by my elders that I must carry forward to my children and grandchildren. Good morning. I'm going to start with a prayer, and I'd like everybody to pray in their own way. Prayers are very important because it's our way of connecting with our helpers and guidance from the greater being. So if you would pray in your own way, that would be good. And we want to try to have a collective thought process, one voice, one mind, and speak for the things that we appreciate and value, and hope things can become policy that will protect them in the future. Okay, Nina. Okay, napinatusi. Ayo kipitaki kokumisi. Spumukits patbiopa. Creator, we ask you for a special day, for your guidance, for your direction that we need as we move forward to establish policy, as we have discussions to understand the interests that all people have in the greater landscape, and your natural gifts that you have provided for us from Spomita, which represents the sky beings and all the high-flying birds that fly high up in the sky that represent with the sky beings Spomita. We ask special blessings for all the beings that represent Sakumita, which is the animals and the plants and the water and everything that's on the surface of the earth itself. We ask that that be recognized in our thoughts today. We also ask, Creator, that we pay special consideration to Spomita Pixie, Sweet Pixie. Sweet Pixie represents the underground and underwater beings and all the animals and plants and fish and all those things that live underneath the water and underneath the earth's surface. And that is the worldview of our becoming people, that when we pray, we ask for guidance and direction. We represent from the sky beings to the earth, everything that's on the earth's surface, to everything underground and underwater. And so that is what I wanted to share with you today in a prayer, and I hope you all prayed in your own way, that we have a good discussion, a good positive discussion that gives us guidance, as we have a lot of different interests we have to think about when we gather and try to establish policy that's going to impact everything that the Creator has gifted to us for our survival, but that we must care for and take care and value. And so I want to thank you all. I appreciate the invite to participate in today's forum. This is a great opportunity, and there's some great people that we will be sharing our thoughts and discussions with you. And it's just much appreciated on my part to be asked to be a part of it. So I want to thank you all for those that sponsored this and put it on, and appreciate being involved. So that's what I would like to share with you today.
It is now my pleasure to welcome Sasha Spector, our forum moderator, and turn the program over to him. Sasha is the program officer for the environment at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Sasha and the foundation are extraordinary leaders in landscape conservation and climate resilience funding at the national level, showing us all the way forward. Thank you for joining us today, Sasha, and take it away.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks to the entire Network for Landscape Conservation for the invitation to be with you today. Thanks to you, Terry, for that powerful and important grounding of our conversations today. I'm extra pleased that you'll be able to remain with us and participate in our panel discussion. I'm Sacha Spector, the Program Director for the Environment at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, and I'm speaking with you today from Sleepy Hollow in the Hudson Valley of New York, the ancestral lands of the Lenape people along the banks of the Mehicanatuck, the river that flows both ways. I was born and raised here in a small farming town in black dirt terrain on the edge of the New York City commuter shed. And after pursuing research and conservation work on 4 continents, it was my luck to return to this valley, to live and work and experience the immense satisfaction of collaborative, large-scale place-based conservation, landscape conservation, addressing land protection, community revitalization, and climate adaptation in a 4.5 million acre region in partnership with towns, states, federal agencies, and many amazing NGOs. I mention all this because to me, landscape conservation is deeply personal. It's about one's love and commitment to place that matches the technicalities of scale and jurisdictions. Today, I lead the environment team at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, which for over 2 decades has been supporting the protection and stewardship of landscapes across the United States. We work at the intersection of biodiversity and climate change, restoring and managing the land. We're also supporting a range of efforts to create a more diverse and inclusive conservation movement. We like to say that we've contributed to the protection of over 2.5 million acres across the country, but it's the how that's been the most important element of success. We're focused on collaboratively conserving resilient landscapes and communities. We're convening today at a moment of national turmoil. The coronavirus pandemic has frozen our economy and disrupted many semblances of normal life and impacted the health of over 4 million of us here in the United States. And I want to send my personal best wishes out to everyone on this call who's dealing with this virus personally, in your family, or in your extended relations. Urgent movement for racial equity in this country following the murder of George Floyd and so many other Black, Indigenous, and people of color is another layer of crisis that provides context for our discussion, as well as the underlying extinction crisis. And yet, this is a moment of immense potential for landscape conservation and the kind of collaborative, place-based work it represents. The pandemic itself has highlighted like never before how critical nature and equitable access to the outdoors is for health, for healing, for societal well-being. At the same time, we are experiencing enormous political opportunity. The recent passage of the Great American Outdoors Act and the introduction of important new bills like the Replant Act and connectivity bills at the state and federal level are showing a real path forward on policy, and we'll get into that in a moment. Public support for conservation and land protection is continuing as strong as ever. Since the pandemic began, 9 out of 10 local initiatives at the ballot for public funding have passed. And people believe more than ever before in investing public funds for the landscapes around them. Globally, the launch of the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration is setting us up for 10 years of dynamic action across on the landscapes across the world. And the 30 by 30 goal of protecting a third of the planet's surface is increasingly solidifying as a target for the Convention on Biological Diversity and for countries themselves around the world. The recent release of the IUCN's global guidelines for connectivity is a new milestone for the practice of landscape conservation around the world. And increasingly, we have powerful spatial tools that bring our ability to visualize and plan at the macro scale of landscapes down to the ground to enable partnerships and implementations with precision at the site scale. Today's conversation is going to be primarily focused on the policy dimensions of landscape scale conservation, and it's really hard to imagine a better group of people to help us understand the dynamics at play than the folks assembled here today. As a preview, the arc of our conversation will start from the success of this moment and turn to 2 key challenges facing our field, and then turn to the path forward, helping the network and hopefully everyone online today see a role for themselves in advancing landscape scale conservation and the agenda in the months and years ahead. I'm so pleased to be moderating this forum today and to welcome our august panel of 5 experts and conservation trailblazers to this important discussion. And I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. It's my honor to welcome Sally Jewell, former US Secretary of the Interior, and previously the President and CEO of REI, and the interim president of the Nature Conservancy. Collin O'Mara, president and CEO of the National Wildlife Federation, the largest wildlife conservation organization in the United States. Dr. Mamie Parker, former assistant secretary for the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and currently on the board of directors for the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. Lynn Scarlett, chief external affairs officer at the Nature Conservancy, and former deputy secretary of the Interior. And finally, Tony Wasley, director of the Nevada Department of Wildlife and chair of the executive committee of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Thanks to all of you for taking the time to be here with us and to share your important insights on the path forward. For each question, we're going to give somebody first crack and somebody second crack. And then, of course, our hope is that you'll all bring your incredible experience to bear on these questions. And so we're going to make sure that we leave time for a really rich conversation, but it will be structured. And then, if there is time at the end, we'll dive into some additional questions that we've gathered during the registration period. So let's start with some recent success. The Great American Outdoors Act just passed both houses of Congress with strong bipartisan support. And assuming President Trump signs this bill into law in the near future, the Land and Freshwater Conservation Fund will be permanently funded at its full authorization level, and there'll be major new investments in infrastructure that create better access for Americans on our public lands. I think everyone on the line today understands that this has been a key goal for the environmental community for decades, and it's a milestone that naturally gives us a chance to think ahead and maybe make longer plans. So my first question is for Collin. Maybe you could tell us what you think this actually means for the conservation movement, how the practices of land conservation can help achieve the Act's intent, especially looking ahead at the potential for a green recovery in the coming years.
Yeah, no, thank you, Sasha, and thank you all for being with us. The turnout is amazing. This is a huge deal, right? I mean, in the words of Vice President Biden, right? This is a big freaking deal, and it's been decades in the making. It's going. I mean, thinking back to the conversations that many of our organizations were involved with Stuart Udall and Scoop Jackson back in the '60s. The fights in the late '90s and early 2000s trying to get the program fully funded. I mean, this has been an intergenerational fight and a huge priority. And frankly, the Land and Water Conservation Fund piece of the Great American Outdoors Act is by far the most successful land conservation program in our history. And so the ability to plan, the ability to focus on true ecosystems of greatest need, the ability to invest in some places that have been that haven't had the same level of attention. Maybe some of the southeast forests, some of the grasslands in the plains. Some places where there just hasn't been as much investment. But I mean, for me, like some folks are kind of covering the story like this is kind of this unicorn that kind of appeared out of nowhere. And I would argue over the last couple of years, we've actually seen a growing kind of conservation majority popping up in the Congress. And again, this doesn't suggest alignment on EPA issues and kind of climate issues, but at least on the investment side, we saw folks coming together on the fire fix. We saw folks coming together with a better farm conservation title of the Farm Bill. We saw the Water Resources Development Act pass the House of Representatives, not the most bipartisan place right now, unanimously, just this week. Same thing in appropriations. And so I'm actually encouraged that we're actually seeing greater focus on collaborative conservation, kind of this concept of kind of conservation without conflict, investment-led conservation as a way to bring the parties together. And look, there's no shortage. To your point, Sasha, I mean, I would argue there's no smarter investment to rebuild our economy than investments in conservation. We know that every $1 million we spend is going to create about 33 jobs. So that job ratio is one of the highest of any investment you can make. We've been talking a lot about the need to kind of reboot a civilian conservation corps, and folks have leaned into that conversation in a big way. And so I see huge opportunities. And look, we should be talking about $100 billion of investment over the next 4 or 5 years. I mean, that's the scale of ambition that we should be having. And look, just a few quick areas. I think the most exciting piece of legislation that's in the queue right now is the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It's going to invest heavily in species conservation at the state and regional level and tribal lands. It's $1.4 billion a year. It's got huge bipartisan support. It actually passed the House through as part of the infrastructure package that we have some work to do in the Senate, but huge opportunity for landscape scale conservation and connectivity. The work around corridors. I mean, the fact that corridors and crossings have basically become commonplace in legislation now at the tune of $50 to $100 million is a big deal. We also need to be investing heavily in our forests, both private and public. The National Forest backlog is a disgrace, and frankly, the next major backlog that we have to tackle. We also don't have dedicated funding for grassland restoration. We don't have a NACA kind of wetlands equivalent for grasslands, and obviously that's one of our most impaired ecosystems. And look, there's other opportunities on reclamation, on coasts, but we should be thinking big. And I'll just end with this. There's a package that a bunch of House Democrats and some Republicans put together looking at about $100 billion of investment over the next few years. It would create 3 million jobs, 3 million jobs, putting folks to work in rural communities and urban communities across all different kinds of projects. That's the level of ambition, and we've done the legwork. We've shown these things can be bipartisan. I mean, the fact we're going to have a signing ceremony next Tuesday, most likely, on one of the most bipartisan accomplishments shows how far we can go. But now we need to take that political capital we've generated, take it out for a spin, and really use this to lead the COVID recovery.
Thanks, Collin. Sally, I saw a lot of nodding while Collin was talking. I suspect I'm seeing a lot of agreement over there. Maybe we could take that potential of really amazing new investments and think about what this moment then opens up in terms of putting that to use through new strategy, new national conservation approaches that span the kind of public and private sectors, or the jurisdictions or scale that make landscapes work.
Yeah, thanks, Sasha and Collin. Thanks for your enthusiasm that I share over the Great American Outdoors Act. And finally, bipartisan movement on something that should never have been partisan under any circumstances. I just want to begin in the spirit that Sasha and Terry did by acknowledging that I'm sitting on the land of the Coast Salish people. in a city that is named for a tribal leader, Seattle. So it is a privilege to be here and to be among this august group of people. And I think about these waters that I can gaze out through my window that I'm actually shortly going to be on as I take next week off sailing in the Salish Sea. These waters have been stewarded along with the land since time immemorial by the people, the many tribes in this region. And we have so much to learn if we would just listen. In addition, I just want to recognize that there are many public servants on this call, and I want to thank you for your service to this nation. It's a rough time to be a public servant, and it has been for more than a decade, and I saw that up close and personal when I served in government. But you are incredibly dedicated to your work in stewarding these lands and waters, even though you are consistently underappreciated and underfunded. And also, I would say federal public servants and state and local public servants are your key partners as members of this community of landscape conservationists in working together to craft smart solutions and to do it so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So I think the Great American Outdoors Act gives us an opportunity, when combined with this pandemic, which has given people a different appreciation for nature, with the clear inequity and injustices that have been brought forward through the death of George Floyd, but also the conversations that it has opened up. So I hope that as we think about the investments in landscapes and public lands that's going to happen with the Great American Outdoors Act, that we can do that through a new lens to say, how do we listen to disadvantaged communities? How do we help repair some of the damage that may have been done through the decisions that were made on planning that disadvantaged some communities and advantaged others? One of the major parts of the Great American Outdoors Act, of course, is permanent funding at $900 million a year for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. That's stateside and it's federal. And there is pent-up demand, as I am well aware of, as would Lynn Scarlett be from working in government. Department of the Interior manages the list. The list is very long for the federal projects. Likewise, there are state projects. So how do we engage in communities that we haven't traditionally engaged in to listen to their thoughts? And I think of, you know, the East Wenatchee Park in my home state of Washington, designed for the Latino community by the Trust for Public Land, and you know, they'll be working to provide the matching funds for Land and Water Conservation Fund. I think about the Badger 2 medicine area that Terry referenced in his comments, that Secretary of the Interior James Watt leased for oil and gas development in the Reagan administration, and the tribe and its leaders and its elders have worked for 40 years to get those short-term decisions undone. And it's been a lot of time in the courts and a lot of effort on the part of subsequent administrations to try and support the tribe's wishes. That's landscape level conservation. That's landscape level understanding. And we've got so many opportunities from Yellowstone to Yukon, you know, the Great Plains, the prairie potholes, the Appalachian Mountains, the removal of obsolete dams. And in all of those places, I would say we need to look through that new lens as we put this money to work so that we can show that we really are committed to change more broadly. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sally. Terry, did you want to comment at all on the Badger 2?
Well, I just want to say that the tribe has, and some of our traditional leaders have worked on this for a number of years, but even prior to former Secretary Watts' decision, there was concern by the elders at that time that there was kind of intrusion on some of the historical homelands of the Blackfeet. And what they were sharing at that time in the 60s and 70s, my grandfather and some of them, was that they felt that the Badger 2 medicine was kind of a target to promote development. And kind of their thought process at that time, even prior to a lot of these things that took place, was that if they can establish and get into and develop Badger 2 medicine, then it would open up the opportunity to get into Bob Marshall Wilderness. It would also maybe open up the opportunity to get in Glacier National Park, which is a lot of our historic homelands and ceded lands of the Blackfeet. So they had those discussions going on way before the Watts decision, and just had concerns, and they were very intelligent people. So I just want to state that.
Thanks, Terry. We have time for one more comment on this around national opportunity and strategy. Anybody else want to dive in?
I will, if that's okay.
Sure.
Speaking of the Great American Outdoor Act, I totally agree with what I've heard about the opportunities for us to look at that act and that funding beyond, the traditional communities and look into non-traditional communities. I look for opportunities for us to look at some of the parks in the urban communities and look in neighborhoods where my cousins in Chicago live, or my cousins in Oakland or wherever, and for opportunities there to help to revitalize some of those communities. And what I've noticed in the past is that those areas have always been at the bottom of the list and what was left over. And so I'm hoping that this is an opportunity for us to certainly do what I've heard earlier, to look at this with a different lens.
Well, Sally and Mamie, you've both just given us some really, I think, vivid examples of, where we've fallen short and how we might do a better job. Sally, given your vantage point from the top of Interior a while back, or throughout all your work, really, maybe you could give us a couple key steps that you think, in the policy dimension, where we could just make sure that our investments in landscapes are building a more inclusive conservation model that engages and generates benefits for everybody.
Yes, I know that Mamie and I are tag teaming this question, and I feel like, I just can hardly wait for her perspective, because
Yeah.
it's valuable to listen to over the years. First, I would just encourage all of us, as both Sasha and I demonstrated, to recognize place in every setting. Because what that does is it acknowledges the people who were stewarding these lands since time immemorial. And it reminds us that we have a responsibility to these lands, just as they demonstrated. So if you're not sure of the original inhabitants of the lands that you occupy, I just encourage you to get more familiar with it and perhaps reach out to some of those communities, because the descendants are still there. I think that it is probably fair to say that every organization represented on this call struggles with having a diversity in the people that you work with on a day-to-day basis. This is a very undiverse part of our economy, our work together, and we've got to change that. And it's not because people don't care or aren't interested. It's because they oftentimes haven't been asked into our conversations. So I would encourage every one of us, as individuals, as organizations, as public servants, to welcome new faces and to welcome new perspectives into your discussions and onto your teams. But it's not just having a person around the table that is expected to represent an entire group of people. It is to get more critical mass and to listen. Most importantly, to show respect and to build authentic relationships by listening, genuinely listening and learning. I think about landscape level conservation, and as we've used the example of Badger 2, or as I saw John Reynolds pop up in the chat box, the Chesapeake Bay. I mean, this is an area, of course, that I lived on as being part of the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C., and it shows the importance of landscape levels conservation and disproportionate impact by the decisions that we've made before. I'd also say, as we look at additional funding, as we look at challenges to our economy, we have an opportunity to bring back the Civilian Conservation Corps and to make sure that it is inclusive of the people that represent this country. Prince William Forest Park in Virginia was a CCC camp that was segregated, white and black, segregated but equal. While it put young black men to work, as it did young white men, it also was segregated. The lessons of history on public lands like that help us learn how we might do that going forward. And this is a golden opportunity to introduce nature into people's everyday lives in urban areas, on reservations, and across all parts of the country. So we have an opportunity to put our money where our mouth is. And I think that that's really critical as we spend this money and we think about how do we do it in a way, and by listening, that includes a much broader section of the population than has been participating in these discussions in the past. Thanks.
Thanks, Sally. So Mamie, you mentioned the kind of the bottom of the list nature of some kinds of projects that just always seem to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, Sally just talked about a different kind of vision for conservation writ large that's a lot more inclusive in its goals and participants. And so what are the kind of like really nuts and bolts kinds of things that we do going forward to make sure that those projects don't wind up at the bottom of the list, but also how do we kind of keep broadening our perspective? And before you jump in, I just wanted to recognize that you've done more than, almost anybody on building a more diverse conservation workforce, especially, and just want to say that out loud before you dive in.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I had a lot of help too. And in fact, I'm grateful to be here. Thank you for this invitation. I tell you, I'm sitting in my home in Northern Virginia near the Washington, D.C. area in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and proud to be able to say that. But what really makes me emotional right now is the fact that this item, this discussion about equity is actually being included in our discussion. That wouldn't have happened several years ago in some forms. And so that's telling you we've come a long ways. I'm also emotional when I think about the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I spent 30 years there as a fish and wildlife biologist, and with a great career. And then now almost 7 years working on boards like TNC's board here in Virginia, Student Conservation Association, as well as National Wildlife Federation with Collin. But more importantly, working locally with the Chesapeake Conservancy, all of these organizations now have moved into the direction of looking at equity and inclusion. And I think that they realized, and they were progressive in their thinking, realizing that, we have to start. We need all hands on deck to be able to get some of this work done. We need people from all walks of life to be there. I was inspired by my mother, as many of you all know. She was a Southern woman that was an avid angler, a maid, and a sharecropper. And she really encouraged me to really learn to fish on Overflow Creek National Wildlife Refuge, which was near my hometown, right in my hometown. And between her and Marvin Gaye and his song, Mercy, Mercy Me, I was called to be here to do some of this work, but realized that it's not easy to do it. And I just want to say thank you to my fellow panelists, because when I think about progress that we've made in terms of landscape conservation, when we think about where we've been, it's because of visionaries like we have on this call, on this panel. They're practical visionaries, they're progressive, and they're bridge builders is what we really need. But more importantly, they're secret heroes. And I think that's what we need in this landscape conservation movement, is a lot more secret heroes that will look out and think about equity. And when I think about equity, I think equity is being better ancestors, which is what I've heard from one of the ladies that's written the book. It's about speaking up and stepping out. It's about relearning and unlearning some of our traditional ways that we've done business, as Sally has said earlier. It's about people like me, when I had a chance to serve as the regional director in the Northeast, really afraid, but know I had to do this, to tell former Governor Ann Richards that we could not build a mall in Hackensack Meadowlands, that we needed to save that for little brown boys and little brown girls to go canoeing out there. That's what we're gonna need to think more about examples like that as we move to equity. Equity is all about inclusion too. It's about people standing up and speaking out when we don't have a voice. And it's about making people know that we're there in the room when we don't always have the courage to do so. It means that you gotta be there. You gotta let people know that you're there. Lynn Scarlett was really good at that in the Department of the Interior when I had a chance to work at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as the head of fisheries. And she would always say, what does silence mean, Mamie? You know, so she gave me a voice and she made it clear. And I think we need to give voices like that to people of color and communities of color. And they have something that they will bring to the table too. I like it when, Collin, you talk about, and you too, Sally, when you talk about the Conservation Corps. What I hear is that 60% of the restaurants in this country will not ever come back. And what if we found those people, Black and brown people that are in that business, and really transition them into positions there, relearning and unlearning skills that they don't have and getting them involved. All landscapes, and I'll be done after this. Equity is all about all landscapes too. Urban and rural communities. We have, you know, we remember the public lands, but we forget sometimes about the lands here out east. We not always on the top of the list when we think about the land and water conservation funds in the past. We've had to fight for things here on the East Coast. So equity is all about marine as well as freshwater and forest lands. Sometimes, again, we think only about the forest lands and we forget about, we gotta take care of the marine population as well. But equity is more importantly about people standing up and being allies for people that are not at the table. And I think about at TNC, there's a biologist there, Judy Dunscombe, and we were sitting talking, a group of us, about a meeting she'd held about where are we gonna put and site solar panels in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And she wanted to make sure when we start doing this and when we have these discussions, that people of color are taken in consideration, that underrepresented communities are there with the voice. And it was amazing because I think that you talked about listening, Sally. That was one of the things I was most impressed with, is that Judy actually listened. When someone said, well, we should put them all in brownfields, and there was a voice there that said, wait a minute, that's exactly where they put all the toxic waste sites, right? So now we're gonna put all the whatever else there too. And again, I don't think it was intentional that it was said, it was just not the right lens. And the right voice happened to have been in the room at the time to think about people that are normally not there. So equity means a lot. It's about being consistent. It's about building trust. It's about overcoming fears. And it's about moving ahead.
Can I just add something, Sasha?
Yeah, absolutely.
Today is International Rangers Day. So congratulations to all the wildlife rangers out there. But more importantly, I only know that because a young woman of color started a program called the Junior Wildlife Ranger in the Edwards National Wildlife Refuge in San Francisco Bay. And she asked me to do a little video and tweet about it, which I did this morning. Today's day where we've got social media, we've got different ways of communicating, some being used for evil, others being used for good, like this example, is a great illustration of how we can reach new people with messages that like this that I think can resonate, and then combine that with on the work experiences like Mamie had, and people have had over the years through the CCC and so on. How do we leverage those new tools to have a real impact going forward? So happy International Rangers Day, everybody. And, back to you.
Yes.
Thanks for cluing us in there, Sally. Does anyone else want to pile in? We've got a little bit more time.
Well, first of all, I'm just absolutely thrilled to be part of this panel. And I'm getting so energized and excited because there's an optimism here and a forward-looking tone to the conversation, and that's really invigorating. Everyone has said an awful lot of important things, but lurking behind those important things is the question of how. And I do have a couple of thoughts on how does one engage more diverse voices? How does one, let's say, change the priorities so that those places that Mamie mentioned rise to the top of the investment list?
Mm-hmm.
And I think partly that really is going to depend on the criteria and focus. So if you're prioritizing where you're investing in, let's say, solely species diversity questions, you're going to miss the questions about urban place, urban health, connectivity, things that would draw a broader range of populations into the mix. Also, these last couple months and after the George Floyd murder and the elevation of the conversation around racism, I think all of us have been exposed to stories of our history in this nation that many of us are not aware of. And they are places that belong in our nationally celebrated lands. And so bringing those stories to the fore and helping shape our priorities around them, I think can be a way to take this notion we have of enhancing diversity and in a practical way, giving the tools for the decision makers in the Department of the Interior a way to think about systematically and move forward.
That's a good point.
Thank you, Lynn. I can appreciate that. And I thought one of the Obama administration's really beautiful contributions to the framing on this was that our public places should tell the story of America. And I think, increasingly we have to keep driving toward that goal. Not just the past of America, but determining what the future of our story will be through land as well.
Yeah.
Lynn, can I keep you on the hot seat for a second and pivot to our next kind of big issue? And we've just talked about the Civilian Conservation Corps and its potential to kind of reboot our economy. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity in some ways and concern on the other that we reboot our economy right into the same climate crisis that we've been in. And as we know, managing, restoring, protecting land is an enormous part of the solution set for climate. And here in America, agriculture accounts for 9% of our emissions. And at the same time, our forests draw down maybe 15% of our emissions at the national scale. We know that natural climate solutions are a big part of how we go forward. And under many of your leadership at the federal level, we have a mid-century deep decarbonization plan that set out really ambitious goals for the lands component of climate action. 1.5 million acres of additional reforestation per year, avoiding the loss of 1 million acres of land per year going out into mid-century. Those are serious numbers, and activating into this new economy with those goals in mind seems to be just as urgent in this recovery phase as ever. So I guess I want to ask you, Lynn, like how do you think, both in terms of advancing carbon and helping natural and human communities adapt to changes that are already locked in, how do we get there fast enough through landscape scale work?
Yeah, thank you. stepping back a little bit, I think if we look both at mitigation, that is how do we get to a low carbon future? How do we really mitigate climate change? And then we look at the other side, resilience and adaptation, with the effects of a changing climate unfolding across the landscape, whether it's in increased frequency of high intensity storms that hit our coasts and flood them, or along rivers and yield long-standing and unprecedented flooding. Increased frequency of catastrophic wildland fire, something I know that Sally, you would have addressed during your time at the Interior Department. Both on the mitigation side and on the adaptation side require a systems lens and a lens of big scale. We cannot solve our way into the climate mitigation problem without scale. It can't be in little bits and bobs. And so part of that, as you said, Sasha, is nature. It's not all the solution. We need to reduce energy emissions and so much else. But work by the Conservancy and in partnership with others shows that about a third of the emission reductions needed by 2030 to be on a pathway to meet the Paris goals can be done through nature. And high on that list is reforestation, improved forest management, avoided deforestation, not only here, but for those on this or at this event who are not from the United States, around the world. We need to undertake those actions at big scale. We have to undertake those actions at big scale. So it has to be things like a recent endeavor that the Conservancy has been doing in the Cumberlands, 250,000 acre vantage point. That's one footprint. We need to multiply that tenfold or even more. So I guess my first point is we need scale. So yes, this is about addressing climate change, but we need nature and we need nature at scale. Then when you look at the resilience side, and this really connects into the conversation about diversity and equity and inclusion, if you look at a lot of those effects of the changing climate, guess what? They are playing out and adversely affecting acutely disadvantaged communities. And many of those, for example, along the Gulf Coast, in the southern part of the United States, we need to restore wetlands along those coasts, to restore some of the diversion channels of the Mississippi River so that we can actually have a delta reformation. And you can't do that one little town next to another little town, one little project next to another. You need that whole community to work together, and critical, the voices from that community that are affected by any decision made must lead in that conversation, because those decisions really affect them. So I guess that's a long way of saying, whether it's on adaptation or mitigation, big is better, big is indeed more than better. It's essential. Sure. Yeah, yeah.
I'm that guy on the call. So thanks. I want to bring Tony into this because your state, Nevada, has been part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is advancing climate action on many fronts, including natural and working lands. And so, you know, to Lynn's point about getting to scale, I think the last few years have really reinforced for us the role that states have to play in meeting these targets, and the U.S. Climate Alliance and other states are also seeing land as part of that solution set. So, you know, from where you sit, how do we get to that scale, or how do we, you know, use states as the platform for achieving that?
Well, thanks, Sasha. I really appreciate that question. It's a challenge that, you know, we face every day. I think a lot of our challenges on the state side of things are the difficulty in reconciling this really broad statutory charge with a really narrow funding model. And this goes right back to the inclusion, the diversity and inclusion challenge as well. And I just want to take advantage of the opportunity to beat the drum for the Recovering America's Wildlife Act and the funding of land and water conservation, and how important those things are from a state side in terms of giving more people a stake. And it shouldn't necessarily take funding to have a seat at the table, but I think that there is certainly a perceived return on investment, a perceived investment, emotional, financial investment, and it's easier to reach out more broadly and have a more diverse and inclusive audience around the table. I mean, it's you know, I want to highlight that barrier, not to place a hurdle there, but to indicate some hope and opportunity with some of what we're seeing with the funding. But for me, you know, the challenges that we face, it all comes down to people. You know, we talk about that scale issue, we talk about collaboration, and I frequently think about cause or effect. How do we get you know, more people? If we could address those core values, we could get more people at the table, or if we got more people at the table, we could shape those core values. But I don't know that really matters, but what I sense is a ripeness now to embrace nature. There's a ripeness now that it's an opportunity that I think we really need to seize with people who are turning to nature. You know, we need to help them understand perhaps why they're turning to nature, how they're turning to nature, help them with where they can do that, and then what ways they can become engaged in their communities. And again, going back to the diversity and inclusion, and really try to foster a sense of stewardship, a mindset while they're seeking it. I think that we're beginning to see some of this with some of the bipartisan efforts that we talked about in the first question. Certainly to have acknowledgement through CDC's One Health initiative that brings into the picture intact ecosystems, the health of ecosystems. Others have mentioned the importance of connectivity and corridors. Right now, it's our time to shape this narrative. When we look around the world and we look at the pathogens and these pandemics, AIDS, Ebola, bird flu, swine flu, the nexus to animals is an important nexus that we have to insert ourselves into this discussion and drive the narrative in a productive and positive area to try to prevent some from demonizing or verminizing wildlife. You know, there's an opportunity to underscore the importance of intact, connected, functional habitats. And, you know, I think part of the challenge is that we as humans so often fail to see ourselves as part of the system and recognize our impacts. Our thinking is constrained with respect to concepts like landscape, like connectivity, corridor, home range, especially when we have people who live and operate the majority of their lives within a few city blocks. When we look at the magnitude of movements and animals and what we're learning through technology, GPS technology and GIS technology, whether we're talking about these epic migrations of birds or caribou or the monarch butterfly for that matter, we can help shape that narrative to where people begin to shift their view of what constitutes a landscape, what constitutes an intact landscape. This notion of setting aside a few acres here and thinking everything's going to be okay, we need to end that. And I hope with, again, much of the bipartisan effort in the policy arena to bring real attention and real funding to these issues, we can begin to shape that narrative in a real and meaningful way. There's unprecedented numbers of people that are turning to nature right now, and whether they even know why, whether it's consciously or otherwise, there's never been a better opportunity or greater connection to nature for us to foster this stewardship mentality and forever instill collaborative landscape conservation core value in a broad and diverse group of citizens. Whether it's cause or effect, it really doesn't matter, but now is the time.
Sasha, may I offer an additional comment building off something Tony said? How do we pay for this stuff? Two thoughts. One, when you get to the urban context and when you get to climate and trying to enhance resilience, what we do know is, for example, that restoring oyster reefs, restoring coral reefs, enhancing the use of nature for resilience actually can be better, cheaper, smarter. So we already have investments underway for infrastructure. Why not pivot some of that infrastructure to nature solutions? You get nature, you get resilience, and oftentimes these are really cost effective. So that's one thought. Why build ourselves back into the 19th century as we're striving to move forward to a nature positive planet? The second is that I think sometimes in the past, we often thought of our conservation investment as conservation, distinct from the social, the economic, the other contexts within which our investments in nature unfold. And if I could go back to the Cumberland project that the Conservancy is working on, it gives hope that we can put a lot of pieces of the puzzle together and thereby enhance funding that would not otherwise have been available. Because what we have there is an effort through putting in place sustainable timber management, a possible flow of revenues that could then continue to invest, enhanced recreation economy to actually attract people to place and enjoy outdoor recreation and the economic benefits that come with that. So I think if we think of economy, environment, community all together as a package, it can generate some funding sources that might not have been top of mind in our more traditional conservation context.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lynn. And I would love to spin this out for the rest of the session. We will pivot, but there's a bunch of comments in the chat line here that, line up with what you just said around revenue, and actually some concern about what happens as we deal with climate and the revenues that flow into LWCF, for example, and what happens to those oil royalties as they dry up, as well as questions about is there going to be a 2021 climate bill, and where do land show up in that climate bill? I think we all have key questions that maybe that's another session we can follow on with. There's an incredible amount of experience on this call with the actual workings of the federal and state and tribal governments to work at the landscape scale in this collaborative way. And so let's just pivot a little bit to a look ahead, and in real concrete terms think about how we do this. And the Bush administration started collaborative conservation, collaborative conservation, and the Obama administration created the Landscape Conservation Collaborative (LCC) program. Both of those really accelerated landscape scale work. It created frameworks for collaborations and scaled approaches. Right now, we're in an interim period. The LCCs are no more, and the emphasis has been shifted toward the states and their role in working together across boundaries. So maybe we can start with Tony, and then I know everybody here has got something to contribute into this. From a state's perspective, how do you think we take the next step forward on structured collaboration across jurisdictions, and how do we connect these constituencies and lands that are across our boundaries and borders?
Thanks, Sasha. Certainly, some of these decisions relative to LCCs were maybe more politically based. One of the things that Congress did encourage science applications of Fish and Wildlife Service to do was to continue to focus where there were existing and strong partnerships. So oftentimes, we can change the moniker, we can change the brand at a policy type level, but a lot of these efforts are only as good as the partnerships that are on the ground. And so what I experienced and witnessed was a need to pivot on the ground and figure out how to continue to benefit from those strong partnerships on the ground. And that's the ongoing conversation right now, and has been since LCCs, largely were disbanded. There was still some resources, still some capacity within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in science applications, and there's still a strong desire by the Fish and Wildlife Service to assist the states in those conservation efforts. And so we began immediately to pivot and have conversations about, how do we build something that, some of the key words were inclusive and durable. I think there was a tremendous amount of discussion on the word durable, recognizing that we wanted to have a process in place that could withstand changes in administration and some of the high level, changes in nomenclature that may not really result in meaningful changes in terms of on the ground partnership and relationship and implementation. And to that end, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies embarked on an effort to look nationally at landscape level conservation efforts and partnerships, and tried to highlight the key aspects that were consistent across those successful models, and come out with some basic recommendations. And so that's underway as we speak right now. It's diverse, inclusive of industry partners, tribes, NGOs, academic, state, federal, private landowners, and trying to craft some kind of governance, some kind of process, some of the key points and recommendations that have been identified there that are necessary in going forward, include support from leadership, but consistency in terms of how we classify our landscapes, consistency in lexicon, threat categories, sharing databases, acknowledging that some of these geopolitical boundaries are really useless when we're talking about landscape scale or home ranges or connectivity. And so I'm excited. The Fish and Wildlife Service has remained very engaged, has tried to simply take some of that capacity that exists in science applications, work with the states in deriving priority list, species of conservation need, to continue to direct it there, but then also continue to leverage those existing partnerships on the ground to continue to get the work done. And through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, again, looking at the regional associations as well, 4 regions representing the country, tried to take lessons learned from each of those regions and build around the great science and the great partnerships, and create some governance that will add some durability, that will hopefully better allow some of these partnerships and conservation efforts to withstand changes in administration and the naming changes that sometimes accompany that.
Yeah, thanks especially, Tony, for mentioning the role of science and federated science in that. As a scientist, that's especially important to me, I think. I want to turn to Lynn, because you were an architect of that collaborative conservation work in the Bush administration, and then I want to make sure we also hear from Terry and thinking about the tribal perspective on this. And Mamie, you were in the Fish and Wildlife Service, so you might have a little.
I do.
You did. So, Lynn, can you just give us a quick hit on what you're looking for in the next iteration, so to speak? We heard from Tony that durability is really their watchword, but what are you looking for?
Durability is important, but a couple of thoughts. One, I have to confess, I do think we need some tool restoration. We had, with the National Environmental Policy Act, going over probably 4 administrations, a growing drive towards using NEPA for more robust conversation and for affirming collaboration, so that preferred alternatives could emerge out of collaborative dialogue, for example. I think we need more. Those tools are still there, but they have been de-emphasized. I think they need re-emphasis. They're there. They can be a basis for trying to support and incentivize more of these efforts. Second, we do need some funding that is more than one project at a time, 1 year at a time. We had a notion of having a competitive grant funding for collaborative conservation efforts that would last for 3 years. And that would help groups know that they had a little bit of durability from one moment to the next to see through some of their planning and then some of the associated implementation. We have things that look a little bit like that in the Farm Bill with the Regional Conservation Partnership Program that was trying to funnel money into specific areas and priorities, but I think we do need to think about that. I also think all the solutions aren't in Washington. And one concept that I've noodled about, particularly thinking about urban areas and thinking about resilience and thinking about nature in urban places, is how do we transcend the fact that the problem set, nature knows no boundaries, the problem is bigger than individual municipalities. And so I think we need something like resilience districts. I mean, we had these for roads way back in the past when we realized that one city's roads needed to connect to another. Why not, why not for resilience? So these are just some of the ideas, and I'll just add one more thought. Somebody I saw in the chat, or several people have talked about, what about small groups? What about ensuring inclusivity? And I think the Crown of the Continent and the Crown of the Continent Roundtable provide a really interesting model because it's sort of a network of networks, and it presents the platform or opportunity for constantly adding new entities into the mix, but not everybody needs to do everything. So in the Crown of the Continent, those networks cluster around particular shared problems, whether it's invasive species or whether it's sage grouse. I think that model is one that can be inclusive, that we can build upon to ensure that the small organizations are there, that more inclusive dimension is there, but the big groups are still there too.
Thanks. That's a great reminder that the greater than the sum of the parts component of landscape conservation really is critical. So in that spirit, maybe Terry or Mamie, do you want to provide your kind of view ahead of what we need next from a tribal perspective, maybe?
Sasha, one of the things that I would just like to state is that when working with tribes, make sure there's always that government-to-government consultation and inclusion, because a lot of the tribes, when it goes back to the treaties, for us 1851, 1855, there are reserved rights within those treaties that help maintain and sustain the way of life for us. And so I think just making sure that there's true consultation, not just coming and sharing one side of the story and hoping the tribe will rubber stamp it, is important to understand. Tribes have a voice. They have the science background, a lot of our young people becoming educated, but that traditional perspective that they can lend to these types of things, and the responsibility that we have to helping things become durable as we define them as tribes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I kind of want to chime in on that in terms of historical Black colleges and universities too. Reach out to some of them. We have, some good history there with some of the individuals that helped us get there. But I want to speak to NEPA too. Lynn mentioned NEPA earlier, and I'm a little bit concerned about NEPA right now, and make sure that it's in the right place and that we're doing the right things in terms of why it's there, and hold on to the good parts of NEPA that I think have really helped us through the test of time. And then we think about coalitions. Certainly, I want to reiterate what's been said about climate equity and environmental justice, because if we don't bring and continue to bring people to the table that can help us deal with some of those issues, I think we're going to be in trouble. And then another group that I think we kind of forget about is the conservation police officers. We're dealing with police officers in this country on federal lands and state lands. We have them there, and we need to make sure that we're working together to make sure that they're being efficient, that they're being fair, and that they are using some of the same techniques and getting some of the same training that when we talk about what's going on in our cities. So building coalitions with non-traditional partnerships, I think, is important too. And then again, I'm going to go back to Virginia when we talk about coalitions and partnerships. I have the pleasure to serve on the Virginia chapter of TNC, and Cumberland Forest. Sasha, thank you for your support in making sure that the Virginia Clinch River Valley has a great partnership, lots of biodiversity, rare and imperiled species that are there in that area. And of course, those local communities, they work together in Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky to protect the resources there, with 253,000 acres protected. But what I liked about it, I love the fact that it was all about coalition building. But what was more important about it, in my mind, is that it talked about jobs. And it talked about really diversifying the jobs there, transitioning from the coal industry to the recreational-based economy. And that's just got to be a new model that we're looking at throughout the country. And so I, give a shout out to those folks in Bill Kiltrell and others in Virginia that are doing those types of coalitions that are important, because it brings in the funders, it brings in the federal, state, and as well as NGOs in that, in terms of building coalitions. And then someone, I think it was Collin, mentioned the conservation without conflict. And when we think about the LCCs, Sally, that you brought, and I had the privilege, of course, to work with both administrations, so with both LCCs as well as conservation programs with Lynn, Scarlett. But when we think about the LCCs, I hope that we look for things that Tony talked about in terms of species at risk really closely, because Wendy Weber and Noreen Walsh and those guys out there, they're really pushing this. And I think it's something that's important, because when I was at Fish and Wildlife Service working in the fisheries program, as well as the habitat conservation program, we did need to look less on regulatory issues and look for ways to be proactive. And that's why I really like what they're talking about with the conservation without conflict, because it's saying, let's take some of those resources, let's take some of the funds that we can, and move those into being proactive, working with the industry, working with the forest people and everybody to look at species at risk. And so hopefully we can work with Congress to get them to think about putting some funding there. And then finally, in terms of coalitions, the Chesapeake Conservancy does a really good job in technology. And to me, that's where large landscape conservation is headed. We have to look at technology and how they brought in industry into this. They brought in Esri as well as Microsoft to help them do this, realizing that we need both of those entities there, all entities there with us. And so Joel Don and Jeff Allaby and those guys are doing some really great work in the Chesapeake Conservancy. And then last, again, I want to just shout out to National Wildlife Federation for their interest in reaching out to all groups of people. And in fact, when we think about Black and Brown people, they have established a great partnership with the Lynx Incorporated. And the best way I can describe us is like we're the Black Junior League, but we care about pollinators, because we know that 1 in every 3 bites that we eat is because of a pollinator now. We're learning this. And so we have 15,000 Black women throughout this country, and the National Wildlife Federation has gone into a partnership with them. And believe it or not, they are all excited about building gardens, but they're also caring a lot about the environmental justice issues as well. We had a webinar June 4th, and believe it or not, it started at 8:30 at night. It was over at 10:18. We had over 1,000 Black women still on the phone at that webinar, listening to us talk about birds and pollinators. So I just think that a lot of times we have a tendency to rule certain people out, but with a partnership like that, opportunities, little bit of support and a little bit of funding. It's just amazing how we can really grow a group of people like that. So
thank you, Mamie. I mean, you packed a lot
I know.
in there, and that was amazing. I mean, there, you know, the importance of technology and the deep interest in nature and landscapes and place that reside in groups of citizens that we haven't really activated, we haven't reached. And so I think those kinds of the people and the technology powers that generate new coalitions are really, really fundamental for us. And can I ask Collin can I ask you to extend this a little bit and think about, you know, from your perspective at the helm of a coalition, we're at a moment where we need a bigger coalition. We need to drive that. And so how do you think about the coalition that builds health and wealth and resilience of a broader subsection of America, really? And how do we do that through land?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. I love the conversation. Like, I'm excited that the coalition that has kind of evolved over the last several years is growing and more diverse. It's not nearly where it needs to be, but I think part of it's a recognition that, you know, government used to be a place where folks would all kind of make their individual cases and then hope you'd have like this kind of balancing of the equities done by, you know, consummate professionals based on science and, you know, economics to make the call. That's just not the reality right now, unfortunately. And so you see groups basically taking it upon themselves to try to find these collaborative solutions that they were basically presenting to government officials saying, hey, this is already baked, right? These are odd bedfellows, these are different partners, different groups. But like watching the last couple of years, you know, the sportsman groups, and maybe there's some of the greener groups and indigenous organizations and tribes, you know, there needs to be a lot more work in the Black and brown community. I mean, there's organizations like ECHO and those great organizations like Afro Outdoors and others, but I mean, frankly, we have not done nearly enough to lift up the environmental justice voices in these conversations. But that work is most of it taking place outside of government, right? And then kind of bringing these bigger ideas. And I think it's, I mean, hopefully we get back to a place where, you know, kind of government is more functional. But what I've seen through those conversations is what the assumption was before, that there's no way to get, you know, folks on the same page. There's actually a lot of commonality, and, you know, land and place-based work is one of those. I think one of the things that, you know, organizations like mine and others have to be careful of is that it's not just about those, you know, ecologically rich places. It's everywhere. We got to be doing work absolutely everywhere. That's where some of the framing around like, you know, a 30 by 30 trying to restore, you know, 30% of the country is interesting, because all of a sudden that's scalable, right? That could be 30% of your county or 30% of your zip code. Or and again, if we had the investments I was talking about before, then that all fits together. You know, some of the ideas around, you know, resilience that Lynn was talking about, again, I mean, that's localized place-based work, but it's not just, you know, the barrier islands of North Carolina or, you know, all the work we have to do in Florida. It's every single community, you know, parcel by parcel. And so I think for me, as long as we're setting place right, you know, the way Sally said, combined with, you know, table setting, the way that Mamie was talking about, we get to a place pretty quickly where you're not going to be successful unless you have all those partners at the table from the beginning, because we've seen this. I mean, we've all been on the receiving end. When I was running the agency in Delaware, right? If those tables aren't set right at the beginning, you wind up in litigation for decades. And so one of the only ways to kind of get the work done at scale in this moment is to be better on the front end, so you don't have to slow down in the back end. And so I'm really excited though, because I think there's relationships being forged and a recognition around failures of the past and kind of the racist traditions a lot of our organizations are coming out of, but then actually trying to set these conversations the right way, sharing power, sharing resources. I think there's a huge conversation of resource allocation. But if we do that well, the types of nationwide, global, you know, types of investments and types of projects we're going to need, that kind of transformative change is possible because we got it right from the beginning, as opposed to trying to just kind of slap it on and, you know, kind of put the pieces together on the back end.
Mm-hmm.
Build it from the start.
Right.
Thanks. Terry or Tony or Sally?
Yeah, I'd like to kind of build on what Collin said. And I think it's really easy when you have an administration that you view as favorable, that might have consistent actions with your ideology or priorities. It's easy to sit back and let them take the charge and drive policy and you know, programs. And I think what's happened is, in some ways, there was a level of comfort where there were a lot of people in the conservation community that had an 8-year run there that provided some comfort. They got direction and protection and order that was consistent with those priorities. What happened with some changes in the priorities is it's creating a need for us to be more self-reliant, generate those coalitions, be more active in those coalitions in meaningful and purposeful ways. And so, although it's not without some challenge, some frustration, I think it in and of itself will lead to a more durable conservation delivery mechanism and collaborative, process and partnership. That's the story I tell myself anyway. I'm hopeful.
Great. Sally, looks like you want to jump in.
Yeah, just to add a specific example of, maybe something that we can follow in the future. I joined the Obama administration in 2013. There was significant recovery going on all across the eastern seaboard or northern eastern seaboard from Superstorm Sandy. And the Department of the Interior alone received $800 million, which was needed for damage done to facilities from the Chesapeake Bay, up through Fire Island National Seashore. And one of the things that we did was to carve out a substantial amount, I think it was $100 million, or maybe 150, something like that, work with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to grant that money to communities that worked collaboratively, with communities coming together, suggesting how they could put this money to work in a way that made their landscape more resilient in the future. And just one example of a project that I visited, which I think was in New Jersey, was an area where you had a lot of sort of beachside development. The storm had washed away all of the sand. There was enough education in the community that people knew that the horseshoe crabs were critical for laying their eggs to support the health of the Rufer red knot, which Lynn will know more about than I do because she's the birder in the crowd here. Maybe Mamie is too. But the communities got together and they said they trucked in sand on their own dime. And then they said, here's what we want to do to bring the wetlands back and bring the coastal resilient back and build ourselves back so that that part of our ecosystem can be protected from future storms. So how do you use policies and government spending to incent the right kinds of long-term behavior that build resilience, but also have an educational component to bring those communities along so that there is a fundamental understanding of why ecosystems and landscapes are important. So that's just one little illustration, and there's other ones that I could bring out about coal mine restoration and Appalachia and so on. But at any rate, there's great ways to do it if we just change our lens around to say, how can we accomplish a lot of these things that are being brought up in the chat and so on by combining money with things that accomplish all those opportunities. Thanks,
Sally. Thanks. Terry, I'd like to give you the last word here and maybe to talk about what Sally just brought up, is this opportunity to heal land and people in the same frame, in the same set of actions, to do it in a way that sort of respects both the cultures and nature of a place, and thinking about what it takes to create the coalitions and to achieve that kind of goal.
I guess there's a couple of examples I can think of, but one at the local level that I've been very involved in the last 12 years is something that we, as the Blackfoot proper people, there are 3 sister tribes in Canada, and we're the United States citizens because of the border. We started a project around 2008 called the INI Initiative. And what that was is looking at and learning from our elders about the importance of how the buffalo helped, of course, maintain and guide our way of life, but also the important part that they played on the landscape. And so we started this initiative, and we got the elders' input, and what that did was create a really reestablish the Blackfoot Confederacy as a whole, our working relationships, and trying to reintroduce bison back to the landscape along the Rocky Mountain front. And that included Canada and United States, mainly the Waterton National Peace Park and Glacier National Park and the Blackfeet tribe. So we start working with some of our federal agency partners, but also with some of the NGOs, and just building those relationships. Once the elders kind of gave us some guidance and the importance and the stories that we needed to hear that we may have missed out on because of what we went through as tribes through oppression. And that is something that has gained momentum. It has gained acceptance by not just our sister tribes and our tribe here in the U.S., but also by federal agencies, because they want to see the bison back into the lands that they basically manage, which our tribe has reserved rights within. But some of the support that has come from the NGOs through building relationships, how that's starting to drive policy at the tribal level, that we're hoping that at some point in time, whether it be USDA with the Forest Service or Glacier National Park through Interior, we look at some of the management philosophy strategies that we use historically and maybe adopt some of those in some of these agencies that manage some of these public lands that the bison may migrate into. So that's something that was done at the grassroots level within the tribes, and just it's growing momentum now, and other tribes have signed on. It's a treaty it started as a treaty between our tribes and the surrounding tribes, neighboring tribes. Now it's rippling out to other tribes, getting more inclusive into, they want to be on board with this. And so that's, I use that as an example. The other one is a small scale project.
Terry, I'm going to have to ask you to hold it to one example because we want to respect our time, but I also really respect that example of other ways of knowing and doing conservation as just fundamental to the path forward. I want to thank everybody on the panel for participating today. I think it was a really rich conversation that just started to scratch the surface, and lots of comments in the sidebar that's asking for more time. So I think that's a real testament to the experience, and I want to thank the Network for Landscape Conservation for bringing us together. Mamie, you said really clearly this is an all hands on deck moment, and I couldn't agree more with you. I think it's also an all lands on deck moment. And so maybe we need to think about continuing this effort, continuing this conversation to bring the hands and the lands together for landscape scale conservation. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to turn it over to Ernest Cook now to wrap us out.
Thank you, Sasha. Great job. And thanks to all of our panelists, all of our speakers. It's been just an amazing 90 minutes. And judging from comments in the chat, the participants agree with me. I got comments like, I'm so inspired by the optimism here, particularly the potential of getting young and diverse people out on the land. Amazing conversation. 90 minutes wasn't enough. Please make these panel discussions monthly. Okay, we'll take that under advisement. So anyhow, as I speak, a survey should be reaching your mailbox, your email box, asking all of our participants, please take just a few minutes, open that email, look at that survey. We'd really appreciate any additional comments and questions that you can give us. So thank all of you for working together to protect the landscapes that sustain us. Thank you again. Bye-bye now.
Bye.